There you go. Cool. John, this book contains a lot and feels very apposite given the acceleration of change, of the meta crisis, of what's expected of business. You know, not a day goes by really. But I'd like to ask you about your life really and how your career has developed. And what particularly struck me is the credit you give to your family and your early life. I just wonder if, for anyone who hasn't read the book, you can talk about any pivotal moments or pivotal influences during your early life, and particularly family, that has led to where you are today and the decisions you've made.
Well, thank you, Donna. That's a complicated question to kick off with, but let me give it a go. So this is my 21st book, and most of the other ones have been semi-serious, and every so often one of them has been a bestseller, like The Green Consumer Guide back in the late 1980s, which sold 1 million copies in 18 months. This wasn't designed as a book like this. This was an attempt to answer a question that I've been asked routinely as I've traveled around the world. I've worked in way over 50 countries over the years. And very often when I started, older people, particularly those working in business, thought that people like me, environmentalists or whatever, Greens, were basically communists, anti-business, anti-growth, anti-profit, all of that. And so for a long time, I denied that I was an environmentalist, or at least didn't claim that title, allowed people to think I was an engineer, an accountant, an economist, or whatever else. And then the questions changed, and younger people started to ask the question, how did this happen? What was it that turned you into what you seem to have become? And I've always said that I've never had a game plan. At no moment in my life have I known what I would be doing in the future. I had a very strong idea of what I didn't want to do. So you mentioned the family context. I think for all of us, family is a very important shaping influence. With me, it was more important because my father was a Battle of Britain pilot. He flew on through the war, stayed with the Air Force. We traveled with him. And so, for example, at one point in a space of about 3 years, we had 9 homes. And so you were thrown back on your family to some degree. Having said which, my parents were broadly supportive, but it took 20 years for them to really understand what I was trying to do. And it was really only when the Green Consumer Guide came out and they suddenly saw this massive wave of media coverage and so on, that they had some sense that there was a semi-grown up working life here. I mean, my father had tried to get me to join the armed forces or to become a merchant banker and all these different things. And I railed and resisted. So the book is the story of several things. It's the family side of it, clearly. And that took me to parts. We lived in parts of the world like Northern Ireland, where we were sandwiched in the 50s between the Protestants and the Catholics. Cyprus, sandwiched between the Turkish Cypriots and the Greek Cypriots. Israel, well, you know the story there. And so everywhere I went as a child, it was into trouble zones I know very often of Britain's making or agitation in some ways. And so I came back to England when I was 9. And so the second part of the story is around education. And just to finish, I was extremely lucky with my education in the sense that the first school was an absolute screaming nightmare. I won't claim it was a concentration camp. It was about as close as we get in Britain to something like that. And the headmaster was finally consigned to a lunatic asylum. I then went on to another school, which was very liberal and promoted independence of thought, which really was the making of me. And then I went on to 2 universities. One was Essex, which was a new university. I got there and it blew up. I mean, this was 1967, 68. and it was shut down for a couple of months by the students. My wife was her prior boyfriend was one of three people who instigated that revolutionary attempt. He's now in the House of Lords, which is so it became this extraordinary education in how the system evolves, how it's challenged, how it absorbs or destroys the people who challenge it. And then I went to UCL, which was just radically different again. So I'll stop there, but the family side was important, and I try and explain why. And just one final element, I suppose, which is that my father was clearly a pilot. I therefore loved planes, aircraft, aerospace. And when I was at prep school, when I was aged about 10, 11, I used to write off, particularly to American aerospace companies, Boeing, Lockheed, people like that, McDonnell Douglas. And they would send me these huge packages. I think they thought I was going to buy an Air Force, but they sent me these huge packages of photographs and brochures, and it gave me this sense of business. And we have these products. We travel on aircraft. I had done quite a lot of that by that stage, and we did. It started me thinking about the companies, the businesses that were behind the products that we experience in everyday life. So that side of my story started fairly early as well.
That's really interesting. The phrase out of that I've written down and actually really shines through in your book and in all your books actually is independence of thought.
Hmm.
And it feels a stark contrast to the world in which we live, where marketing dominates, particularly young people's lives, and very little thought is given to the consequence of choices. And perhaps in business and politics too. And that takes me to your admiration of our Buckminster Fuller, Bucky Fuller.
Yeah.
And there was a quote that you mention in your book from Fuller that talks about politics. And he says politics is doomed to failure. And the quote is, he says, it's ever more wasteful, boring, and inherently vain, and ultimately incapable of solving humanity's basic economic, ecological, and social problems. And he sought to shift from weaponry to livingry, which I think is a very interesting phrase, to create a world for everyone. Is that possible in the current system, do you think?
Well, several things. For those who don't know Richard Buckminster or Bucky Fuller's history, he was an extraordinary, I mean, he was utterly independent of mind. He was somebody who got to a point in his life, and he described it as unplugging his brain and then plugging it back together again. I read his books in the late 60s, early 70s, and for anyone who's read them, they are an absolute nightmare because they're written in this very different language, and you really have to some degree struggle with it. But they had this really profound impact on me. One of the uh, concepts he came up with was the idea of doing more with less, and how his suggestion was that over time our economies would do that. I hadn't remembered him being quite as dismissive of politics as Donna, you just, in reading out his quotes, showed him to be. I think I don't want to put words in his long dead mouth, but he was basically trying to say that politics can solve particular problems, but they then create the next cascade of problems. And most politicians, because of who they are, because of the context in which they find themselves, find it almost impossible to think about those longer term outcomes. I met Bucky in 1977. I mean, it was quite unexpected. I had gone to Reykjavik to cover a conference for New Scientist, and I was already in awe of the man. And I suddenly saw him sitting at a table in this hotel in Reykjavik. So I went over and I said, "Would you mind if I joined you?" And I'll just give you one example. Even though his books were very convoluted and used this really complicated language, he had this extraordinary capacity to conjure almost sort of word images. And one of the ones that really struck me at the time was he said, if you think about the Earth and you visualize it as a 6 foot high or diameter sphere of stainless steel, and then you breathe on the surface of that 6 foot stainless steel ball, the depth of your condensation is the depth of the atmosphere and the oceans. And that just gave me a sense of how precarious in some ways our lives are in this very, very thin
Mm.
skim around this planet of ours. So he was one of many people who had a big influence on me. Many of them I did meet because I had this sort of, apart from this independence of spirit, which you picked up on, I'm endlessly curious, endlessly nosy. And if I wanted to find out something, as with those aerospace companies, I just write to them. And sometimes it worked, and sometimes it took a long time. For example, when I went to Essex University, one of the courses I took was sociology of religion because I wanted to understand from Northern Ireland, Cyprus, Israel, and so on, what was it about religions that made people crazy and hate anyone who believed differently, including in their own religion, Protestants versus Catholics and so on. And we were set a book in that course, which was Dune, which people will know. I mean, Frank Herbert and so on. So this was 1969, probably. And so I thought, well, I like this book. I should get in touch with the author. And so I wrote to Frank Herbert, and he then lived in the Pacific Northwest of America in Washington State, up in the Olympic Peninsula, a place called Port Townsend. And as it happened, I had family all over the Pacific Northwest for reasons I won't go into. Um, and so I wrote to him, and for 3 years, I think, every time he was in England, I was somewhere else, and vice versa, and we just couldn't make it work. And finally, I wrote to him, and I said, I'm coming to Washington State again. I'd love to meet you. And he said, well, unfortunately, I'll be in London. When do you get back to London? So I said, well, I'm at this particular time. I fly in the morning. He said, well, we leave that day. Come and see me. Come and have breakfast with his then wife and him, which I did. And it was one of the most powerful conversations I've ever had. But just the final little wrinkle in the story was that those of you who read the book or seen the films will know that it's about a desert planet, Arrakis, or Dune. And he said, where have you come from? And I said, well, we were staying with friends and family in Seattle and Yakima and places like this. But we went down to Oregon. And when we were coming back, and I hadn't made the connection, when we were coming back, we stopped at this tiny little village, about 3 houses, called Dune City. And it had this really long white sand beach that went on for miles. And he went very quiet. And he said when he was a young cub reporter, as he put it, for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, he was sent down to Dune City to write a story in 1944 about beach dune reclamation projects at a time when the war with the Japanese was going on. Agriculture was really important. Agricultural land was being lost to dunes. And he then had this idea of a series of novels on a desert planet. And it was completely random. It was complete serendipity. But life has been like that. And I think the more you are curious and the more you push yourself out into the wider world, the more serendipity can come into play.
Careful what you wish for, John, because that's why you're here today. and you're absolutely right. There is this sense of, well, what's the worst that can happen? I'm super grateful for you for accepting my invitation today because I'm curious. Just staying on the theme of influencers, Lester Brown.
Yeah.
And a lot of these people I've taken a bit of a deep dive into as a direct result of Tickling Sharks. And
I'm glad to hear that, Donna. I really am. I
yeah,
mean,
no,
that was
there's
partly what I was trying to do.
so many rabbit holes from the book that you can go down. It's fantastic. Um, Lester Brown was someone with whose work I was not familiar, but I took a bit of a deep dive. And one particular quote from him that says, "Massive change is inevitable. Will the change come because we move quickly to restructure the economy, or because we fail to act and civilization begins to unravel?"
Mm.
Two very stark contrasts. Is it that binary? And if so, which do you think it will be?
Oh, I think it is binary, and I think we've already passed the point where the second one is coming into play. Lester Brown, for those who don't know, founded something called the World Watch Institute. He then left it after quite some, well, decades, and founded his own institute. But he wrote many, many books on the future of our economies and how they might change over time. And he again, I met him very briefly back in the early 80s, while I was talking to one of his colleagues at the World Watch Institute. And then I read a lot of his stuff. And then I started going to the World Economic Forum. I was on the faculty there for 7 years, and Lester, or Les Brown, was there. And at once, and I held him in some awe. And my wife Elaine was with me in Davos, and she said, "I think that man is lonely. You should go up and talk to him." And I went up and talked to him, and this sort of extraordinary conversation then um, continued. But to your question, I, I think we had a moment where we could have changed our economy at the scale and in the ways that were necessary in order to avoid, climate chaos and so on. But I think we still can make a huge difference. But 20 years ago, I visited the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution on Cape Cod. And again, I'd met the director at the World Economic Forum. I said, "I'm really interested in the oceanographic work that you're doing. I'd love to come and see you." And he said, "Well, if you're ever on Cape Cod, come along and I'll introduce you to our scientists." And so Elaine and I went, and we spent a full day with the director meeting scientists. And I'd written my first report on climate change in 1978. So I thought I knew climate change. But I quite literally came out of that set of briefings with my knees knocking, because what they were talking about was the way in which the North Atlantic currents, and particularly things called Greenland pump, the Labrador pump, and so on, had started to fade in the late 60s, early 1970s. And they were plotting where that would likely take us with their computer models and the rest of it. And what they were saying was that as I left, they said, within 50 to 60 years, your country, Britain, will have the weather conditions, the climatic conditions of Siberia, because the Gulf Stream is going to shift radically. Now, that was 21 years ago. It was 2003. It's only now that some of that science is beginning to come through into the mainstream media. So as a species, we are pathetically slow at understanding what scientists are learning. And many of the scientists I've dealt with over the years are getting to the point where they're just tearing their hair out because they know, they see what's coming, but they can't get people to pay sufficient attention. And I think that's going to get worse, because I think we're not only moving into a period of massive distraction with social media, massive misinformation and disinformation, but I've felt for quite some time that there is a rhythm to human affairs, and it's not predictable particularly, but about 2 generations is about as long as we can manage as a species without getting ourselves into a major war. And so, I've said this for quite some time, and not without any joy, but and so when the second Ukrainian conflict kicked off, younger colleagues said, "There's your war." And I said, "No, that's like the Spanish Civil War. This is where people test their weapons against a much bigger engagement." So I think the distractions are just going to go off the scale. So just back to your question, it is binary. We could have sorted it out. We have chosen in some ways, or our politicians have chosen, to ignore what we should have been doing and what Lester Brown and others were arguing that we should have done. He basically said we should go on a war footing in a different way.
Yes.
And just as the American economy converted itself to produce weapons, so people who did circus carousels would suddenly do sort of anti-aircraft guns, and people who used to do fashion did bandoliers for bullets. And I'm not arguing for conflict or war or any of this stuff, but it's something as a species we tend to fall backwards into periodically. I think we've missed that moment. It doesn't mean that we still can't do a great deal, but to your question, I wouldn't argue technically that we're utterly screwed, but I do think the scale of the chaos that is coming at us now, and just finally on that, it isn't simply that climate change warms where we happen to live, cities or whatever. It forces massive migration of people. And no, we're fretting at the moment about tiny encampments. I mean, dreadful if you're in them, but in Calais and places like that, that is the tiniest, thinnest end of a wedge of what happens when Africa warms up to the sort of levels that I think it's going to do within a decade or three. I'm an optimist, incidentally. It doesn't always sound like that, but I think you have to be realistic and look at the wider world and see what actually behind the scenes is happening all around us, and that's what I'm trying to do.
That's really helpful. And I think you can be an optimist and face the truth. And you talk a lot about speaking truth to power. And that's really important. And I guess changing the focus slightly, I'd like you to talk a little bit, if you wouldn't mind. In your book, your chief exec of Volans Louise talks about the triple bottom line, which you subsequently recalled, and the three R's, so responsibility, resilience, and regeneration. And I'm particularly keen to hear, unsurprisingly, about regeneration, but you've just alluded to resilience. And I kind of want to go on to talk about Minsky moments, but
Yeah.
can you talk to us about those three R's from got a lot of forward-thinking business leaders. How do we be responsible, resilient, and regenerative, given the meta crisis in which we're operating?
Well, maybe a little bit of background for people who don't know the story. In 1994, I came up with the concept of the triple bottom line. So economic, social, and environmental value created or destroyed by companies, by markets, by capitalism, by whatever. The following year, I came up with a slightly easier to remember people, planet, and profit formulation. And that became the core of, I mean, I was on the board of the Global Reporting Initiative, and that's got tens of thousands of companies doing sustainability reporting around the world. I was 9 years from its outset on the Dow Jones Sustainability Indexes. Again, this was the first ever ranking system looking at companies and ranking them against the triple bottom line. And now we have over 8,000 B corporations around the world, which are also charted around the triple bottom line. And the first one in the UK was Volans, our company. And we incubated B Lab UK, which is behind all of this in the UK for 9 months. And my previous company, Sustainability, was the second UK B Corp. So I'm just setting that context to say, I take what has happened in that space really seriously. I'm really proud of what, insofar as I have had anything to do with all of this catalytically, I'm proud of what we've managed to achieve. But the product recall was something that came to me in 2018. I became increasingly worried that I heard people talking about the triple bottom line and basically as a trade-off mechanism. You know, we there's this economic thing. We make a profit, tick. Well, the economic piece is much bigger than just whether or not you make a profit. Social side, we employ people, we pay them a sort of living wage, we provide people with products and services. Well, and that's a tick. And again, the social side is much, much, much bigger than they were assuming. And then they would say, typically, and a shame about the environment, you know, we've got a big impact. I don't know what to do with that. And the triple bottom line was never intended as a trade-off mechanism. One friend who was a CEO, now CEO or chairman of Johnson Matthey, but was that when I first knew him at ICI and then later at Bayer, the German chemical company, the way he put it was that the triple bottom line ought to be about success, enhanced performance on at least two dimensions, and holding the third one static, so you're not going backwards. So I did the product recall through the Harvard Business Review, and what was really striking, I thought people in business would know what a product recall was, which is not the end of the story. Sticking an idea on a spike and saying that was a really idiotic idea. A product recall, and I'd worked with Ford, Toyota, Volvo, different car companies. For them, you have a perfectly good, well, not always, but you have a perfectly good product, a car, and it gets a wheel wobble, and suddenly you find tens of thousands of cars are developing the same wheel wobble. So you pull them back, you fix the problem, you put them back on the road. And the idea with the triple bottom line was, could we try that same game? A fair number of people, including people in business, read that as, well, the triple bottom line is dead. And it took me, in the same way it took me 18 months ridiculously to get to the three words, the triple bottom line, it took me 18 months to get to why I thought it was wrong and what I think needed to be done about it. And completely coincidentally, and I really hadn't thought about it until afterwards, the three Ps, which went endemic in places like the Netherlands and Australia, New Zealand, that the people, plan, and profit, the three Ps became sort of a formula in this space. When I finished looking at responsibility, resilience, and regeneration, I suddenly realized I had three R's, and they just stepped up one letter. And that wasn't the intent. I wasn't playing that game. But the idea was that most of the work that I had seen, particularly companies doing, of whatever size, on the sustainability, on the triple bottom line, was basically in the responsibility frame. We've got to be nicer, we've got to be a bit better, we've got to be politer, we've got to treat our suppliers better, all of this good stuff. And that is important. But I felt, and I've already explained it to some degree, that we're moving into a period of massive disruptions and dislocations. And that responsibility framework is going to be tested to the limit. And you already see it with companies like Shell, Unilever, Ford, Mercedes-Benz, Volvo this morning, backing off some of the very public commitments they've made to improve their sustainability-related performance. So I think resilience is going to be a fundamental challenge. How do you build that? And what we're seeing is that many of the systems that we depend on, our economies, our societies and communities, our political systems, our biosphere, our atmosphere, they're all starting to wobble like that wheel on the car. And they're showing that we're putting them under such pressure that their resilience can no longer be taken for granted. So then what? And I've always felt sustainability was fundamentally about regeneration. So for me, the third stage of this is to regenerate all of those systems across and beyond the triple bottom line. So regenerate our economies, regenerate our cities, our societies, our communities, the biosphere, and so on. So I'm very happy to talk about that. But that was sort of the sequence that got me to where I ended up. But I can't say at the beginning, like my career or whatever, that I had any great clue when I started where the story would come to roost. That's always a surprise.
How wonderful. Life's what happens when you're busy making plans, that they say.
Poor old John Lennon.
I know.
Yeah.
This was, again, unplanned to a degree, but it is weaving in very nicely, thank you, to my next question, very much underpinned by the need for resilience in a very wobbly world. And actually yesterday, in your tips on Tickling Sharks, John's daily blog at the moment, which is well worth looking at just for a taster of what's in the book, You wrote, "Don't assume sharks." It's probably best if you give a clear description of the four creatures
Yeah.
that you allude to in the book. But don't assume sharks are ignorant of your change agenda. Many know full well what is coming, but conclude they have no option but to buy time and protect the sunk capital owned by themselves or those they work for. As a B Corp, UK for Good, advising businesses, we get this a lot. Hoping, you say, to sell out at the last minute to greater fools, which I thought was an interesting phrase. And then you warn of the danger of Minsky moments, which we've written about before. But
Yeah.
I think in terms of risk and resilience, can you just talk about that a little bit?
Well, let me start with Minsky moments. And I should actually just say something. It's a public health warning. When I went to university in 1967, I was going to study economics. I studied it for 1 year, and in 1968, I gave it up. 1968 was an extraordinary year. Anyone who was alive then will perhaps remember, but everything was seeming to come apart at the seams. And economics and economists had very little to say about all of that. They were talking about the economics of the firm and all the rest of it. So I don't know that much about economics. I'm often described as an economist. I'm not. But I am interested in economics, and I'm interested in the evolution of the thinking of economists like Mariana Mazzucato or Kate Raworth, some of these extraordinary economists that we see nowadays. Um, so Minsky, Hyman Minsky was not somebody I studied at university, although he was already active then. And he talked about the way in which in our economies, um, things start to go well for all sorts of different reasons. So after the Second World War, for a period of time, there was a lot of growth. People then take for granted that health of the economy, and they take bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger risks. And then suddenly the risks just run out of traction and collapse back. And his point was that there are these moments now called Minsky moments where the financial excesses of investors and others suddenly become exposed by the sort of retreating tide of the economy. And I think exactly the same, and this, I'll come on to resilience, but I think exactly the same principle applies to our ability to understand the ways in which conflicts evolve. So I think, again, I think I said something like it a little bit earlier on, but to repeat, I think it takes about 2 decades, sorry, 2 generations for people to forget not only what war was like, but how we find ourselves drifting into war. And then we find ourselves going down exactly the same, well, not exactly, but very similar pathways. So I think we're in a period now where it could be in the Middle East. It could be between India and Pakistan. It could be with North Korea. It could be between the United States and um, China. It could be between Iran and Israel. You've got all of these different tensions, and you've got these different uh, coalitions starting to come together, exactly as you had before the First World War, with Iran and Russia and China and so on coming into this sort of, I am not going to use the term axis of evil because I think that was a certain Bush character at his worst. But nonetheless, you see the dynamics of growing conflict. So I think resilience is going to be fundamental at the individual level, at the family level, and already with cost of living crises and so on, we see the impact on families and communities of just slight disruptions. And I'm not saying that the energy price rises and COVID and so on are slight, but they're typical in some ways of the sorts of shocks that I think over the next 15 to 20 years, we're going to experience many more of. And therefore, we've got, going back to Fuller's dismissiveness about politicians, it's not that all politicians are stupid. Many of them are very intelligent people, but they've been schooled to think in a certain way. Their party dynamics have encouraged them to behave in a certain way. And it is, I mean, I keep finding myself today, I don't normally do this, but going back to conflict-related similes. But in a war, for about 18 months to 2 years after one starts, you have utterly incompetent officers completely screwing up because they have no idea how to start or to fight the new war. And then you have a different generation who come through who think and behave very differently. I think exactly the same is going to be true in politics. I would suggest that by 2030, we will look out to transform political landscape where almost all of the politicians that we currently know and pay attention to will no longer be there because a very different set of people will have had to come through. Some of them will be populists. Some of them will be people we really, well, certainly I don't wildly approve of, but some of them will be competent in new ways. So I think the resilience story is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly important. And it goes out not just to individuals and families, but to companies and their supply chains. So, for example, with America pressing down now on China, all sorts of companies are having to sort of reconfigure their supply chains. COVID wound that one up for them as well, as did the bans on Russian oil and gas and so on. So again, this resilience challenge, I think, is something we're going to have to pay a lot more attention to. And then the best way to ensure long-term resilience in every system is to think about their regeneration and then to invest in and work on that. Sometimes over decades, in some cases, we'll have to do it over generations.
Yeah, and that's the tension, isn't it? I was reading yesterday, day before, an update on the carbon budget and talk about 2 years and AMOC and planetary boundaries. You know, whatever piece of scientific data, whether it's the latest CAR6 on the IPCC, it doesn't, or it's a risk report, you have to go a long way before you think, oh yeah, we've got plenty of time. We've got 2 generations. So that tension between absolutely understanding, very clearly understanding, and any scientist or excuse me, that's my Donna stop asking questions alarm and give other people an opportunity. Can I ask you one last question before I do open up the opportunity to the room? Otherwise, it's really unfair.
Yes.
I'm going to quote this directly from the end, almost the end of the book, because it really hit home to me. And for those of you who haven't read it, it's right, I think it's the last chapter. It's covered in scrawls, my book. It says, however much we may have done in the past, none of us can retire responsibly from a dysfunctional system that threatens the future of all life, human and non-human. Now that we're all in the same planetary boat, and this is the bit that got me, it's time to step up or jump overboard. I mean, that's a really strong message to business leaders and political leaders and individuals, I guess. How?
Well, in the context of what's just happened in the Channel, you know, that's a rather unpleasant way of framing it. In 2020, we did a big conference with Aviva, the financial firm in the City of London, and on it was called Tomorrow's Capitalism Forum, and on the wall I had in very large letters, and quite a number of the participants from business and the financial world looked at it slightly askance, but it basically said, "Step up or get out of the way." Now, that's not quite the same as jumping overboard, but I just think that we're getting to a point where people are taking up a lot of space in terms of media attention and so on, who have very little to add in terms of how do we address the resilience challenge? How do we practically get into the regeneration challenge? And just yesterday, I had one of the most exciting calls I've had all year. I've got to, in Antwerp, do a conference, I think in October, with something called the Roundtable on Responsible Soybeans. I didn't know it's the largest largest commodity market for any sort of crop product. But the RTRS, Roundtable for Responsible Soy, they're saying they want to get to the point where that is the roundtable for regenerative soy. And the thing about soybean, as many of you will know, is that it is a regenerative plant. It puts nitrogen back into the soil. It's often used in crop rotations with cotton. So the soybean puts nitrogen and other nutrients back into the soil. Cotton runs it down, and then you do it again. Question: can you take degraded land around the world and use soy to bring it back into some sort of health? So I think we have to step up, and that applies to people like me. And I'm 75 now. I'm a baby boomer, for better or worse. And the book Tickling Sharks was looking back at 50 years where I've worked in this space professionally, and then trying to look 10 to 15 years into the future and saying, if what I think we should be concluding now is true, what does each of us now need to do in order to really live up to our responsibilities, to our families, obviously, and to our nation states and the rest of it, but to future generations and future generations of all life, not just, human kind. So it's a big canvas that I'm trying to paint towards the end. But I'm basically the message which you just read out, Donna, is just trying to say to people, wake up. Because it's very easy to think about, doing the next year's sustainability report or having the next stakeholder roundtable, whatever it is. But that, although nice to have, is like a village garden party, a fete or whatever. It doesn't materially address the systemic crises that we now face, which you referred to right at the beginning. So if not that, then what? And I'm just going to add to the pain where I've said already that I'm using military metaphors too often. But when I talk to senior leaders in around the world, one group of people who routinely surprise me are the generals and admirals and air marshals who are looking at the future and thinking about what are the implications of the climate emergency and the biodiversity emergency and forced migration for our boundaries and frontiers and all the rest of it. So we've got to start paying attention and pulling some of those people into the conversation as well. Hopefully I've stirred the pot, or we've stirred the pot sufficiently to get some
gosh, it's a very large pot that could have lots more stirring, but conscious of your time and our members' time, let me just have a little look and see what questions our group has for you. Kathy, would you like to ask your own question rather than me speaking for you? I can see you. There she is. Go ahead. You're on mute, Kathy. Just want to introduce yourself to John and the rest of the
Hi,
group.
John. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Donna. I'm from HM3 Legal. I recently B Corp'd, thanks to Donna and her team guiding us through it. So my question is, with all the challenges and the sort of competing priorities of business, if you like, how do we persuade businesses that sustainability even matters to the day-to-day? There's so many challenges for them.
Well, I think thank you for the question, and congratulations on the B Corp status. I think there are many different dimensions to the answer. And the first one is, I think we've got to step back a bit and we've got to ask ourselves the question, sorry, this is the front door, it'll be answered, but we've got to ask ourselves the question, why is it that the way we've been presenting this set of challenges to date hasn't really engaged many people in business? Now, it has engaged a lot more people than when I started 50 years ago. I mean, it's now taken for granted by CEOs and senior people in business that this is going to have to be dealt with somebody at some point, but by God, they hope it's not going to be them. but then, the laws change and suddenly you're being required to do sustainability reports or whatever it happens to be. Okay, so we're going to do that, or do different things with the supply chain. Okay, we're going to have to do that. But the danger I see at the moment is that compliance wave is building very sharply, particularly from the EU. And I think it's inevitable, and I think in some ways it's necessary, but it takes the whole thing back into the lap of lawyers. No, with the greatest of respect. And lawyers are not wildly innovative typically because they don't like taking serious risks. And we're at a point where as societies and as people involved in economies, we've got to take much bigger risks than we're used to taking. And so I think the compliance mindset is important and necessary, but actually it can be it can disable companies going forward. Practically to your question, I think we just got to firstly revisit our own agenda, think about how we best present that. If we're going into a particular boardroom or C-suite or equivalent, what is it that's going to be number one on their priority list at the moment? How does what we're talking about either link to aggravated risks in that area or potential sort of combined solutions? And one of the things I just say in the Substack series, it's called Rewilding Markets, which Donna kindly referenced earlier on, is the idea that as individuals, we tend to align with people that we like, people who are comfortable. I feel comfortable with all of you lot, so there's a temptation to stay here. But we've got to engage with people who we really don't like, whose missions and purpose in life and so on, styles of operation, we are deeply uncomfortable with. And the whole idea of tickling sharks is, how do you do that? How do you get much closer to people who think they rule the world? The oddity is that quite a number of those people who we think imagine they rule the world actually feel massively constrained by the competitors, by regulators, they feel they absolutely like Gulliver. They have absolutely no freedom of maneuver at all. But how do you get close into those people and persuade them that this is something that's surfacing on their watch? It's something that they're going to have to take seriously. And there are people already doing elements of this already from whom they can learn. And just finally, one of the things I think makes a huge difference is getting people out of their offices, out of their companies. Because after COVID, where we've all been encouraged to stay, home, work from home, all the rest of it, we've slightly got out of the habit of going out to see what other people are doing. And I think learning journeys, study tours, these sorts of things for senior people can be a really, really important way of waking up to the fact, it's not impossible because it's happening here. I think those sorts of lessons are powerful. Sorry, I'm taking too much airtime. I'll stop.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Never too much airtime. Does anybody else have any questions for John while we have him here? Celine, would you like to say hi and ask the question yourself, or would you like me to ask it for you?
Hi, I'm happy to ask the question.
Please go ahead and introduce yourself.
So I'm a recovering sustainability practitioner, and I'm now trying to look at how we can amplify the organizations who are more in the regenerative transformative space. And my current project is actually building work experience around that for young people, because it's business as usual for them a lot of the time, or green jobs over there as a separate silo. And I suppose my question is, it feels to me like there is so much going on in the sort of new seeds growing, but that's not where the attention is. The attention is still on the big old existing legacy systems. And, is it that we just need to sort of shine, perhaps naive question, but shine the light elsewhere in some way? I mean, what's your sense of that? Are we nearer a tipping point in that sense than perhaps we think we are?
I love the question, Celine, and I think you already know the answer, which is that exactly as you say, at the edges of the system, underneath the system, all around it, all sorts of initiatives were taking place. And periodically, I've spent time doing particular books or whatever it happened to be, to go and visit some of the people working on clean technologies, social entrepreneurs around the world, and so on. And one of the main foreword to the book is contributed by Hannah Jones, who was the first chief sustainability officer at Nike, which is, you know, a company that is now going backwards on the sustainability agenda. To your point about, you know, the big incumbents, are we focusing too much attention on the swoosh and things like that? And I think the answer is we are. And part of what I'm trying to do on this Substack series of posts is to raise the question of whether we've, and I've been very much part of this, over-obsessed with individual companies and their brands and their boards and their business models and their supply chains and so on, and forgotten to pay sufficient attention to how you redesign markets such that you're no longer dependent on individual CEOs getting religion, you know, suddenly, like Ray Anderson at Interface that reads Paul Hawkins' book and it's the spear in the chest moment. Well, that's lovely, but you can't do that with every CEO. So how do you reconfigure the environments in which they operate such the incentives give them almost no choice? So back to Hannah. She now, as many of you will know, runs Prince William's Earthshot Prize. And so that's this 50 initiatives around the world that each get £1 million over, it's 10 a year for 5, no, it's 5 a year for 10 years. And when I look at some of these prize schemes, I look at not only just the people who win, but the people who were in the running. Exactly as you say, there are extraordinary initiatives out there. The problem is that they're struggling, many of them, to scale. And just in the Financial Times this morning, you had something about 5 clean tech businesses in solar and biomass fuels and things like that going bankrupt in the United States because they've got to a certain point. They pulled in hundreds of millions of dollars. They were steaming along, but then there's this sort of gap which they can't get across. So I think we've got to pay attention to what people at that sort of micro level are doing and give them every support that we can. But at the same time, we've got to work on the question, how can we reconfigure markets such that people don't fall into that hole and that they sort of steam through? And what I'm trying to do is to pick examples from around the world where, you know, the process has only just started, but where that gap is being filled in different ways. Sometimes, like with the Inflation Reduction Act, or in the United States, or the Green Deal in the EU. But these schemes are, I mean, they're great as far as they go, but they're stopgaps. They won't really sort of dig us out of the hole into which we've got ourselves. So I agree with you. I hope that your recovery process continues. I wouldn't give up on the bigger companies because I think in those very big companies, there is still a huge amount of resource and talent and potential if we can sort of steer them into the right path. And some of these things will split. I mean, Ford has just split. Solvay has just split. I remember working with Bill Ford in the 90s when he was chairman of the Ford Motor Company, and him saying to me, basically, Ford will never split. It'll always be, you know, this monolithic entity. Well, they've split now into one part doing the legacy business, internal combustion engines, one part doing electric vehicles, which isn't doing very well, incidentally, because incumbents really struggle to get into these new markets in the right way. But I think we can't simply stop paying attention to the big companies because they still have the potential to run riot all around us and steer our economies in the wrong direction. But thank you for the question.
Thank you, Celine. Thank you, John. We are pretty well out of time. That's gone so quickly. I'd like to finish with one final quote in your book, which is the final page, that says that you feel the glory days and the glory years are yet to come. And that gives me hope. I really hope you're right. Like you, I'm an optimist. And I think many people, many of our members, many of our community are also optimists. Most of them are on the B Corp journey, either certified or on the way, and actually determined to shape a better world in the simplest form, because our children and future generations deserve it. John, thank you so much. I'm glad you encouraged me to be curious and to reach out, and that resulted in you coming, but I really appreciate it. I will share this recording for those that weren't able to make it, but
Please do.
Great to see you, and keep up the fantastic work.
And huge thanks to everyone on the call, and good luck with whatever you're doing. And it is doable still, despite what I said. I mean, we can still make this work. It's going to take a little longer and a little bit more effort, but good luck.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. Bye-bye, everybody.
That was
see you
great.
On 5th of December is our next chat. We'll see you then, hopefully. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.